Okay, so you want to own a restaurant. You've got a recipe people love, a location in mind, and a dream of watching a packed dining room every single night. It feels like the most human business there is. Feed people, make them happy, get paid. Here's the problem. Restaurants run on some of the thinnest profit margins of any industry in America, and the debt structure used to open one can quietly destroy a chain that looks packed and beloved on the outside. By the end of this, you'll know what it actually costs to open a restaurant, why turning a profit is harder than people assume, and why one of the most iconic seafood chains in the country collapsed into bankruptcy despite feeding 64 million customers a year. Let's start with getting in the door. According to industry data, average startup costs for a new restaurant now run well over $375,000, covering the lease deposit, kitchen equipment, furniture, initial inventory, staff training, and permits. Depending on size and concept, that number can run from a few $100,000 for a small casual spot up to several million for a full-scale dining destination. And most new restaurants don't turn a profit right away. Industry data shows it typically takes 6 to 18 months to reach break-even, and some concepts take up to 3 years before they're consistently profitable, which means you need enough cash reserve to survive well over a year of operating losses before the business even proves itself. Now here's the number that actually explains this whole industry, and it's the margin. The commonly repeated line that 90% of restaurants fail in the first year actually traces back to an old advertising campaign with no real research behind it. The real data is still rough, but nowhere near that dramatic. More careful studies put first-year failures somewhere between 14 and 30%, and roughly half of all restaurants close within 5 years. That's still a brutal survival rate for a small business, but the reason so many restaurants struggle even while staying open isn't necessarily closure, it's that the ones that survive are often barely profitable the entire time. The average net profit margin across the restaurant industry sits somewhere between 3 and 9%, with most independent full-service restaurants clustering closer to the bottom of that range, while quick service and fast casual concepts with simpler menus and lower labor needs tend to land a few points higher. The reason that margin stays so thin comes down to two line items eating almost everything before you see a dollar of profit. Food costs typically run 28 to 35% of revenue, and labor costs run another 25 to 35%, meaning the so-called big three of food, labor, and rent can consume upwards of 2/3 of every dollar that comes in the door before you've paid for insurance, utilities, marketing, or a single repair on a broken walk-in cooler. And neither of those two big costs sits still. Raise your food cost by just 3%, and your wage bill by 4% in a single year, without adjusting your menu prices to match. And a restaurant that started the year at a 6% profit margin can end that same year sitting under 4%, a huge relative hit built entirely from ordinary inflation nobody budgeted for. There's a third pressure squeezing that margin even further that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's third-party delivery. Apps like DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Grubhub now route a meaningful share of orders for most restaurants, and those platforms typically charge commissions somewhere between 15 and 30% of the order total, just for the referral and the delivery, on a dish that already carries a 30% food cost and a chunk of labor baked into the price. Handing another 20 or 25% to a delivery app can turn an order that looked profitable on the menu into one that barely breaks even or loses money outright once packaging and payment processing fees are factored in. Some operators try to offset this by quietly raising prices on delivery app menus compared to in-house prices, but that only works until customers notice and start comparing. This is exactly why so many restaurant owners describe delivery apps as a trap they can't easily walk away from. The orders bring in real volume, but at a commission rate that eats deeper into an already thin margin than almost any other cost on the books. This is exactly why a restaurant that looks successful, busy dining room, good reviews, loyal regulars, can still be one bad year away from real trouble, and nothing illustrates that better than what happened to Red Lobster. In 2014, the chain was sold to a private equity firm for just over $2 billion, and to help fund that purchase, The new owners sold off the real estate underneath roughly 500 of Red Lobster's own restaurants for $1.5 billion. Red Lobster didn't get to keep that money, it went straight back to the buyers. What Red Lobster got instead was a permanent rent bill on buildings it used to own outright. By 2023, those lease payments alone totaled around $200 million a year, close to 10% of the entire company's revenue, just to keep operating restaurants that used to be debt-free assets on the balance sheet. Layer on rising food and labor costs, and then add one final blow, an all-you-can-eat shrimp promotion in 2023 that was meant to run for a limited time but got extended into a permanent menu item after customer traffic jumped far higher than anyone projected, and the promotion alone lost the company more than $11 million in a single year. In May of 2024, carrying roughly $300 million in debt, on top of those crushing lease obligations, Red Lobster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, closing around 100 locations almost overnight, some of them so suddenly that employees showed up to find a closure notice taped to the door with no advance warning. The lesson underneath that collapse isn't really about shrimp, it's that each restaurant's real financial risk often isn't the kitchen at all. It's the real estate and debt sitting underneath it. A single independent restaurant with a manageable lease and disciplined food and labor costs can absolutely survive on a 3 to 9% margin for decades. A restaurant or an entire chain, saddled with rent obligations designed to extract value for someone else's balance sheet, is playing an entirely different, much more fragile game, no matter how many customers walk through the door every single night. So let's close the loop. You put up anywhere from a few $100,000 to several $1 million to open a restaurant, and you should expect to run at a loss for the first 6 months to a year and a half before the business proves itself. Once it's running well, food and labor alone will eat up roughly 2/3 of your revenue, and delivery commissions can quietly take another slice on top of that, leaving you a genuinely thin 3 to 9% net margin most years. That margin can absorb a normal bad month. It cannot easily absorb a spike in food costs, a wage increase, a sudden shift toward delivery orders, or a lease that was structured to benefit somebody other than you. And unlike a business that can simply raise prices to match rising costs, a restaurant has to do that carefully because customers notice menu price increases almost immediately, and pushing prices too far, too fast, can shrink your traffic just as your margin needed that traffic the most. So the next time you walk into a packed, thriving restaurant with a line out the door, understand what you're actually looking at. You're not necessarily looking at a business getting rich off your dinner bill. You're looking at an operation running on one of the thinnest margins in retail, where the real difference between a beloved local institution and a bankruptcy filing often isn't the food at all. It's who actually owns the building underneath it.